Good morning to our listeners in North America. Good evening to our listeners in Hong Kong. Good afternoon to our listeners in Europe. And if you're in some other time zone, well, good, whatever it is. I'm David Goldman, Asia Times Deputy Editor, and I have the enormous honor to welcome Professor Steve Koonin to an Asia Times webinar in conversation with uh, Asia Times Editor-in-Chief Uwe Parpart and our science editor, Dr. Jonathan Tennenbaum. Uh, Professor Koonin is perhaps the most controversial person on planet Earth at the moment. We've just had a Group of Seven meeting in which the entire focus of policy was around climate change. Climate change is the buzzword of virtually every political decision. Corporations are being ranked by various indices based on their carbon footprint. And in the middle of this, Professor Koonin, who was the most important scientist in the US government under the Obama administration, has questioned the entire apparatus, not so much the science behind climate change, but rather the interpretation of it and the political use to which it has been put. He's the author of a bestseller, Unsettled. If you give me a moment to share my screen, I will show you a copy of his book. Unsettled, What Climate Change Tells Us and What It Doesn't and Why It Matters. I assume that after this webinar, after you view this, you will all go out and buy it immediately. Professor Koonin is a distinguished physicist, a professor at New York University, was the Undersecretary for Science at the U.S. Department of Energy. The U.S. Department of Energy is the largest scientific research organization of the United States government. So, in effect, he was America's chief scientist under the Obama administration. Hardly a radical climate skeptic, rather a mainstream scientific figure who has proposed to reevaluate the way we're looking at it. And that really has put him at the center of a hurricane of controversy. So with that, let me remind you that you have a Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please do give us questions. After the first half-hour presentation, we will be taking questions from listeners. We look forward to them. And with that, let me turn it over to Dr. Tennenbaum to start the discussion.
Great, thank you very much, Dave. Steve, we've had a coverage of your book in Asia Times, a review of mine, and then an interview with you in May. But I think for the benefit of our viewers, it would be good if you just very briefly sort of put on the table, what are the main statements, what are the main messages of your book?
You know, Jonathan, when I hear politicians talking about an existential threat justified by our scientific understanding, I'm reminded of a line from the movie The Princess Bride, where one character keeps using the word inconceivable, and the other character says, "You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means." And the analogy here is, I don't think the science says what the politicians think it says. In fact, when you read the reports from the UN and the US government, and hardly anybody does, you find some surprising things. There are no significant trends in extreme weather, or at least very few, even as the globe has warmed by about 1 degree over the past century and a bit. And so we need to have better information about the true state of the science conveyed to the public and decision makers. And I think that's the main takeaway from the book. We need better information. And I've written the book to try to inform rather than persuade.
Thanks a lot. In fact, having read the book, it's extremely informative. And I mentioned it's a kind of a very good introduction to the whole field of climate science. In that sense, I highly recommend it to people who want to get in and get, okay, what is climate science? Where does it stand? But before going into a couple of specific points on that, I'm very curious about the reaction. And I happened to pick up, and I wanted to ask you specifically, an event that occurred at Lawrence Livermore Lab, which you have played a role in for many years. Maybe you could talk about that, because it's sort of as I understand, one of the most famous climate scientists, Ben Santer, basically wanted to keep you from speaking there. You were invited to speak there about your book, I suppose. And then, as that didn't work, actually said he was going to cut off his relationship to Lawrence Livermore Laboratory. Can you please explain what happened there?
Yeah. So just a little background. Lawrence Livermore National Lab is one of the 17 premier research laboratories that the Department of Energy runs. And in particular, it has a particular expertise in modeling, mostly developed in the course of trying to understand nuclear weapons, but they have a significant climate science, climate modeling effort as well. And I have been a trustee, governor, director, independent of the lab for about the last 7 or 8 years. And I was invited by one of the organizations within the lab, the Center for Global Security Research, to talk about the book and some of the things I have found in the assessment reports. That's important because the US has declared climate change a national security issue, and so the lab is trying to educate itself. Ben Santer, whom I know and is a good climate scientist, is unfortunately one of the foremost defenders of the faith, if you like, and has been promulgating and upholding a narrative that we've already broken the climate and we face certain doom unless we change our ways. And so he got pretty upset and made the statements you said. I gave the talk about 2.5 weeks ago via Zoom. There were probably 400 people on the Zoom call from across the lab, and it was a perfectly fine talk. The audience was engaged. They were respectful. They asked some good questions and made some good comments. So in reality, it was a non-event. I am scheduled over the next many months to do many more talks in public at national laboratories and universities, and I hope to find the same respectful engagement. Whether people agree or disagree with me, that's fine, but that's how we do science.
Yeah, I would certainly hope also that there are climate scientists that will engage you in those events, so that when we get a real debate on, up front, that people can get into what the issues really are.
I would like to think that, it's going to be hard for people to find criticism for what I've written, because almost all of the book is not my science, but it is the science in the official reports and quality research literature. And in some ways, I've just kind of pulled back the curtain a bit or circumvented the chain of misinformation that goes from the research literature right to the media.
Well, on that, I wanted to ask, it's common to hear that 97% of climate scientists agree that human activity is responsible for the global warming. But I've looked at there's a study done by the American Meteorological Society, a survey back in 2013, according to which 22% of the most expert group in the sample, did not subscribe to the position that global warming is mostly human caused. So whatever of course, only they say only 3/4 of the AMS members responded to the survey, which you can interpret in different ways. But came to the conclusion, the notion that expertise is the single dominant factor shaping meteorologists' views of global warming appears to be simplistic. We found that perceived scientific consensus was the factor most strongly associated. What do you say to that?
Well, first of all, the 97% number, which has somehow found its way into the zeitgeist, has been thoroughly debunked by poor statistical methods, very biased sampling of papers. But even if you believe it, 97% subscribe to what? All right, there's a whole chain of statements. Is the climate changing? Sure, I'm part of that. I subscribe to that. Are humans influencing the climate? Absolutely. Okay. Is that going to lead to catastrophic changes in the ecosystem or society? I think most people would start to ask questions at about that point in the chain of logic. When I talk to climate scientists, almost all of them, you get a good, honest discussion of what the certainties and uncertainties are. It is just some small fraction, and then some of the scientific institutions and a lot of the politicians and media that promulgate this notion of a monolithic consensus. But again, when you read the reports or the literature, it just isn't there.
I know that the IPCC, the authoritative international body charged with climate policy, has all the statements in their main summaries are qualified, very likely, medium likely, and so forth. So you can see, and also large range in the predictions in terms of the amount of warming and so forth. So if one looks at it, one does get the sense that a lot of questions are open.
And even more so when you dig into the reports themselves. And we should remember that those summaries have the heavy hand of government in their writing.
Oh, yeah. I mean, how large do you think is the, how would you say, sort of group pressure or the pressure in general on climate scientists not to be completely open about what they, about certain aspects of the research? Or I don't know how you would place it. I can imagine that because there are institutes here in Germany where if you would call this question of main, that human activity is the main cause, if you would put a question of the warming, put a question mark on that, you would be regarded as an enemy of the people, the equivalent of an enemy of the people. It's very difficult and risky for your financing. Is it that way in general, or what would you say to that?
I think it is, and maybe two anecdotes. Maybe six and a half years ago, when I wrote my first public piece, an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal that said, this science is not as solid as you think it is. I then had a conversation with the head of a first-class geosciences department at a major university in the US. And he said to me privately, I agree with just about everything you wrote, but I dare not say it in public. And that really caught me up. Subsequent to the publication of the book, I've gotten many letters, not from climate scientists, but from other scientists who said, gosh, I'm glad that you wrote that. It really educated me some about climate science, and hopefully will lead to others being able to speak up and at least ask difficult questions.
I actually noticed, and that gets to the next question I wanted to raise on the issue of the red team approach. I've noticed also that physicists particularly tend to be a bit skeptical, although can be very expert on the physics, because it's in terms of the projecting what will happen to climate, the causes and so forth. Basically, it's a physics issue, although it involves geology and so forth. Physicists tend to be skeptical. I, with mathematical training, tend to think, well, it's a nonlinear system, very difficult to model. That could go in different ways. A nonlinear system could do something very nasty. Or in any case, it's very difficult to make reliable predictions. But on this question of the authority, or let's say of judging the state of climate science, you hear the argument, Koonin is not a climate scientist, he's an outsider. Is it really a situation where a so-called outsider, a scientist, but somebody who's not in the middle of the field, how can such a person, what is the method? What is the authority of a situation where such a person or a group of people carry out a red team exercise? Can one then? How does one get to the truth there if you're not an outside? If you're not an insider?
Well, a lot of physicists by persuasion or by training have a penchant for poking their nose into other people's business. And I might note that some of the prominent climate scientists, Stephen Schneider, Michael Mann, Jim Hansen, have degrees in physics or engineering fields. So there is not one thing called climate science. People come at it from many different points of view. With respect to an outsider being able to judge, physicists, as I said, do that often. I've personal experience in weighing in on quality standards for the Human Genome Project, on guidance systems for some important precision-guided weapons. I testified to Joe Biden's Senate Foreign Relations Committee about 20 years ago on dirty bombs. So, you go in and you start reading and you start asking questions. In the case of climate science, some of it is pretty simple. If the report says there will be only a few percent economic impact from a warming of 4 or 5 times what Paris is trying to limit us to, I think it's a legitimate and simple question to ask. How come you keep saying there's a climate crisis when the report actually says it's going to be a minimal effect? Mm-hmm. Similarly, how come you buried a statement that there are no trends in hurricanes in the back of the report? And the headline statement says, oh, it's going up and it's getting worse. You don't need much expertise to do that. You just need to be a careful reader.
But a specific issue I wanted to pose is that of the climate modeling. You go into that in the book in some length, and we did that in the interview discussion that's published in Asia Times. There you get to some real scientific issues. And there is a question. I know that you, back about, well, you will tell me, you had a session, I think a one-day kind of session with climate scientists and with other scientists. And there you come to the question. It seems to me, as far as I know, and please correct me, the really crucial issues are not just qualitative, they're also quantitative. In other words, is this effect or the continuing warming, is this going to be really bad, or is it going to be, let's say, the human, the CO2 or a hot, what do you call it, hothouse gases?
Greenhouse gases. Yes.
Yeah, greenhouse gases. Contribution to the warming. Is it going to be very large, or is it going to be small? That makes a big difference for decision making. So here you are as an outsider, so to speak, and you're talking to people who are doing these models. Now, what are you asking them? How can you really get a reliable notion of how far they have come?
Okay. So the modeling of complex systems is widespread activity. It's not only in climate, but it is in aircraft, it is in weather, it is in some of our complicated military systems. And so, this activity is not done in a vacuum. There are certain common issues.
Mhm.
Did you conserve what you're supposed to conserve? How do you handle phenomena that are too small to describe in the computer? You have to make assumptions about them.
Mhm.
And so those are natural questions to ask of the climate scientists. Moreover, the climate problem is particularly difficult because we don't have good observations over enough time. It's hard to observe the oceans because nobody's there, and oceans at depth are very hard to observe. And human influences are a small 1% perturbation on a chaotic system with long-term cycles. And so you can ask those, you don't need to be an expert to do that. And then you can ask, how come Model A got this, but Model B got something very different? And neither of them agree with what we've seen observationally. I mean, those are kind of simple questions. You don't need to be a deep expert. Of course, you can dive in as appropriate, and I have occasionally done that. But by and large, they're simple questions. And when you ask the climate scientists, they say, Steve, you're right, but we're doing the best that we can.
Okay. I notice there are a very large number of global climate models. It's dozens. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. And that's about the right number. And there are a couple dozen institutions building those models. They're not all independent of one another. Sometimes they take subroutines from one and use it in the other and so on. But they all give different answers. And the reason they give different answers is because largely you have to make assumptions about very small scales, clouds, thunderstorms, convection, and depending on what assumptions you make and how you tune the model, you'll get different answers.
Okay. Well, one thing which I think thoughtful people will tend to worry about is this notion of tipping points. You have a nonlinear system where a small perturbation possibly, in principle, could be amplified by positive feedback into a very large effect, so that conceivably, a priori, you could get a very nasty things happening. Of course, by the same argument, you could have nasty things happening without the human perturbation. But this is becoming more and more a point of discussion. And this tipping point concept is coming up more and more in the public discussion, particularly on the ice melting. And that by this, the ice is melting, polar ice melting, glacial ice is melting. And by this, in some way, more CO2 is being liberated. So there you would have a positive feedback process. That sounds scary. What would you say?
It always helps to look at the data. And the main concern about ice melting is that the Greenland ice sheet and the Antarctic ice sheets start accelerating. I think it's good to remember that the Earth has been coming out of a little ice age since the 17th or 18th century. It ended in the middle of the 19th century and is still going on in some ways. And consequently, the ice was much greater 400 years ago than it is now. So, and that melting, of course, is an entirely natural phenomenon having nothing to do with human-caused greenhouse gases. If you go back further in time, the last so-called interglacial, the time between ice-covered Earth and such as the period we're in now, was 125,000 years ago. It's called the Eemian, and sea level was 6 meters higher than it is currently, and the temperature globally was about 2 degrees warmer than it is right now. So there are powerful natural forces. We have seen sea level rise before. Whether our current human influence, which really started growing in around 1950, is driving the current melting or not, I think remains to be seen. One of the problems is Greenland was melting as rapidly 80 years ago as it is today. There are big natural fluctuations in these melting rates. So I think the jury is out, but even if it is, Greenland is contributing a grand total of 1 or 2 millimeters a year, less about 1.5 millimeters a year in sea level rise. Okay, that's pretty small. The total global sea level rise is 3 millimeters a year, or a foot a century, and it's going to take a long time if we're going to see a significant rise that we won't be able to cope with.
Could I, Jonathan, may I cut in here?
Please.
Steve, the typical politicians, sort of climate activist or whatever statement that you hear all the time is, unless we do such and such tomorrow, then, whatever, catastrophe ensues within, and then there's a little bit of a difference about the time that it might take. How do you deal with this? I mean, given these uncertainties and given the fact that people get away with that, and that any debate is tends to be shut up, very quickly. Well, what should in fact be happening? I mean, there's something to be addressed. How do we deal with it? So, what would you propose? How about going?
Yeah, I think the first thing we do is to have an honest conversation about the science and take the hype away. And that means we've got to make sure that the official assessment reports are transparent, accessible, balanced. And then the second is that the scientific community has got to be calling out the politicians and the media when they overstate. The third thing, and we can go through a whole list of things, we've got to keep observing the climate system with precision and with continuity. We've got to improve the modeling, and we can get into how. But then I think we have to realize exactly what the magnitude of the challenge is if you want to reduce human influences. We need globally to reduce CO2 emissions to 0 by 2050 if you want to stabilize at 1.5 degrees of warming, and by 2075 if you want to stabilize at 2 degrees of warming. Given the growing demand for energy as most of the world develops, given that fossil fuels are the most convenient and reliable way of getting that energy, we have to admit that there's no way we're going to meet those goals. And even if we did meet them, they would entail a tremendous reorganization of society. And I think we have to have the values debate about, is it worth it, given the rather vague and distant projected impacts of warming? We have not had that debate. It's always been about emotion, and we've just got to do something. Well, what about the 40% of humanity that don't have adequate energy? Isn't it immoral not to worry about that?
Yeah, I mean, just a quick follow-up. There's on the economic side, a pretty tight correlation between GDP growth over the longer term and energy intensity, for example, of the economy. So if are we going to give up economic growth, in order to meet certain climate goals? Whose growth are we going to give up? Are we going to give up growth in sub-Saharan Africa or in Brazil, or where, or in Sweden?
Right.
So it seems to me that yes, obviously this has to be a broader debate, and we have to look at the consequences of some of these things that are being proposed. 30 kilometers per hour in German cities is not going to swing it, right?
No. Most people, unless you've studied it, have no sense of the scale of the energy system, of how it operates, and how long it takes to change it. I like to say you change the energy system by orthodonture, not by tooth extraction. And what's being proposed now in the US and many other countries is a whole mouth treatment. And that just isn't going to fly. We've seen the yellow vest protests. We've seen the flap in the UK about the cost of heat pumps that they attempted to mandate. And I think we're going to be in for that in the US over the next 5 years as these policies start to affect people's daily lives.
Maybe I wanted to get into one aspect of that a little later, or as the question after the next one. Then I think the plan was to go to questions from the viewers. But let me bring into something which is really very interesting, which is the question of geoengineering. And I didn't realize until I read your book, and then began to look around also at some of the papers and some of the documents on this, that the perspective of actually cooling down the Earth's atmosphere, by releasing aerosols in a controlled manner is a very serious option. I noticed here, there's even in the US National Academy of Sciences, a committee on geoengineering climate. There's a report by the Royal Society, Climate Engineering, Geoengineering the Climate Science Governance and Uncertainty. So this is something which is not some kind of science fiction, apparently. And I understand you were directly personally involved in some of those studies. Can you say a few words about that?
So I was about a decade ahead of the academies. I convened a group back in 2008 for a nonprofit foundation called Novim. And we did a study on what would it take to actually mount a research program in geoengineering. But let me give a little background. The Earth's climate, or the Earth's temperature, is set by a balance between the sunlight absorbed and the heat given off by the planet. And they have to be in balance to within better than 1%, otherwise the planet would be heating up a lot or cooling much more rapidly than we see. As the greenhouse gases exert a warming influence, it's a natural idea to think of, well, maybe we could make the Earth a little more reflective and therefore keep it cooler so it would absorb less sunlight. And in fact, you don't have to do much. The average reflectivity of the Earth is about 30%, namely 30% of the sunlight gets reflected before it's absorbed, instead of being absorbed. And if you made it 31% instead of 30, you would counteract all of the warming influence of CO2. We see that phenomena happening naturally. When a large volcano goes off, for example, Pinatubo in 1991, it puts up an enormous amount of particles into the stratosphere, high up in the atmosphere, that cool the planet because they make it a little bit more reflective. And we actually saw the temperature of the Earth drop by about 0.5 degree for a couple years after Pinatubo went off.
Isn't that a lot of material, though? I mean, is that?
Yeah, it is. But, you know, it stays up there for a couple of years. The notion that we humans could do the same sort of thing has been around for quite a while. Mm-hmm. And estimates suggest it's quite doable. You would have to put up a fair amount of sulfur into the stratosphere, but whether it's with artillery shells or balloons or planes, it's quite doable and not very expensive. A small country could choose to do it on their own, or even a wealthy individual like Mr. Gates or Mr. Buffett, Bezos, etc. Needless to say, there are lots of uncertainties. What would be the collateral effects? Would you change plant growth? Well, there is reason to believe you would change precipitation patterns a bit. So who gets to decide whether we do that or not? What are the tests you would want to do and so on? So it's very much an interesting area of research. It's difficult to do field experiments. David Keith is a guy at Harvard who used to be a friend before I wrote the book, has been trying to do a field experiment off of Scandinavia. And he was shut down by the Scandinavian government, who says, we don't want you doing that sort of thing to the climate system, even locally. There are lots of issues about governance, as you said. So I think we need a research program in it just to know whether we've got this in our back pockets in case something really goes catastrophic, but I think that's very unlikely. I would note, by the way, as we said in that 2008 report, an important part of any research program is much better and more precise monitoring of the climate system itself, so that you would know what effect you had when you started putting aerosols up. So it's got kind of a dual use anyway.
Mhm.
We're now slightly past the midpoint of the hour. It's time for a word from our sponsor. First of all, now that you've heard Professor Koonin, please do go buy his book, Unsettled, most controversial book of the decade. And secondly, Asia Times asks you to become subscribers to Asia Times. We present these events as a public service, and we're honored to have the participation of distinguished speakers like Professor Koonin. But in order to do so, we do need the support of our readers, as indeed do all publications. So when you go back to the Asia Times website, please do subscribe. We will now begin to take questions from the audience. The first comes from a listener who has worked on nitrous oxide mitigation in China. Listener points out that China has tremendously under-resourced air pollution, and people who've looked at satellite data say that China isn't doing enough to reduce nitrous oxide emissions. Given that China and India are the two most populous countries in the world, China is probably the world's biggest economy already, and India is one of the largest, are any of our plans meaningful without the participation of China and India? And where do you expect those two major countries to go?
The answer to the primary question is no. Unless China and India and the rest of the developing world come along, whatever the US and the EU and the rest of the G7 do is not going to make much difference at all. Just to give you one quantitative example, the US currently accounts for about 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions. If it were to go to zero tomorrow, it would be negated. That decrease would be negated by about a decade's worth of growth in the rest of the world. And the need to bring the rest of the world along has been well recognized and articulated by President Biden, Ambassador Kerry, and just about everybody else who's looked at this problem. On the other hand, those countries that you mentioned, as well as the rest of the developing world, need energy, and fossil fuels are the way they're going to get it. We see coal plants being constructed at a furious rate, coal production and consumption going up. And so I think, and again, it's just my opinion, the world is not going to be able to even stabilize human influences at the level it aspires to.
Another listener asks whether the emphasis on technologies to mitigate carbon emissions are entirely a negative for economic growth. For example, hydrogen fuel cells could end up being more efficient than internal combustion engines. Is it possible to have a win-win situation, the listener asks, where at least some carbon mitigation technologies actually contribute to growth and productivity as opposed to deduct from it?
Yeah. I think I'm a big supporter of research, development, and demonstration of emissions light technologies. I think electrification of automobiles is something that will happen eventually. We're not quite there yet in terms of cost and operational convenience, if you like, and we can go into that. But in terms of economic benefit, I think we need to remember that where a technology is developed versus where it's manufactured versus where it's deployed are three different things. And the economic benefit, for example, of solar cells, although invented in the US and to some extent in Europe, the big manufacturing now happens in China, and of course they're being deployed all over the world. So I think unless a country is also a center for manufacturing, you're not going to see much of the economic benefit from innovation.
Another listener asks, how is it possible that the governments of the world are focused on policies which change everyone's life, reorder the, reorder the allocation of trillions of dollars of capital based on a wrong interpretation of scientific data, which is widely available if you read the fine print? What's going on in their minds, and how do you account for this enormous discrepancy between the vast commitment made to climate change technologies and the inadequacy of the science or its interpretation?
Well, I wouldn't exclude that some of the people in the political sphere truly believe that we face an existential crisis. As I said, that's not supported by the science. On the other hand, I like to quote something from H.L. Mencken, who was a thinker, a journalist in the early 20th century in the US. And he said something like the following, I won't get it exactly right. The purpose of practical politics is to keep the public alarmed by a series of threats, mostly imaginary, so that they're clamoring to be led to safety. And whether it's immigration or climate, or to some extent COVID, although I believe COVID was a serious threat and we've dealt with it, although there are very interesting questions emerging about how truthful some of the scientists were about its origins. I think that's what politicians do. You've got to have some big grand cause in order to marshal society's efforts. And that's fine from my point of view. Let us not misrepresent or distort the science on the way to doing that. And I think it's a responsibility of scientists to call out the politicians and say, no, no, you're wrong.
Uwe and Jonathan, I know you've been saving questions and you've been texting me, so please let me give you a chance to jump in at this point.
I wanted to say, go ahead. Well, I wanted to just ask you about nuclear energy, because I've been writing a lot about that and following also fusion research. Of course, I remember that you you inaugurated the National Enrichment Facility at Lawrence Livermore back, I don't remember now when you were in the DOE. So these are very important things, and many people, there is a tendency, Biden has also stated this, that he thinks that more effort should go into developing nuclear energy, small modular reactors and so forth. Right next to Germany is a country called France that gets 70% of its electricity from nuclear power. And it's very interesting that the environmentalists here in Germany don't say too much, don't demand so much that these plants should be shut down. And the French are not apparently also not thinking of shutting them down soon. What do you think about the role of nuclear energy in this whole situation?
So let me just use the stated US goal of an emissions-free power sector by 2035 as a benchmark. Many of the environmentalists and people who don't really understand the energy system think we're going to get there by wind and solar and maybe some storage. The problem is you have to generate electricity when it's needed, or you have to store it to deliver it when it's needed. And while wind and solar are pretty economical in terms of generating, cheaper than almost all of the other alternatives, they produce only when the weather is correct. The sun is shining or the wind is blowing. And so you need some backup, whether it's massive batteries, which are not there yet in terms of cost and scale, or the only dispatchable, reliable emissions-free source that we have, which is fission. I mean, there is some hydropower, yes, but the US is pretty well built out in that. And so you're going to need nuclear fission if you want to have an emissions-free, reliable electrical grid. The problem is that the big reactors that the US and France rely upon for power are very expensive and they take a long time to build. We've not built a big reactor in this country for 20 years. We're trying, but it's been delayed and over budget and so on. And so I think a very realistic hope is to learn how to build smaller reactors for electrical power. We do that for naval vessels, submarines and aircraft carriers. And the question is whether the designs can be adapted for civilian power. If you can do that, you can at least make the economics a lot more forgiving than if you have to put down, $8 billion, $10 billion to build one behemoth. Much easier to put down a series of billion-dollar investments for smaller ones. So we're working on that. Fusion, which is the other form of nuclear energy, is still very much in the research stage. It's not yet been demonstrated to produce energy in a useful way. There are a number of government efforts, ITER most importantly in the south of France, but also a number of small startups in the US and in Europe that are making interesting progress. The problem is, even if you demonstrate it, in the end, it's got to be better than the alternatives if it's going to be commercially viable. And that's a long way to go. But I would say it's worth trying on a 30-year time scale.
So the challenge is going to be what? I mean, energy policy is one thing. What else? I mean, there are people who are just saying, okay, let's stop eating meat, or let's, I mean, I'm not, it is, this is obviously not just, these kind of beliefs are not just scientifically based. They are quasi-religious, or, whatever you might want to call that, ideology-driven, and so on and so forth. But would you say the focus has to be energy policy, or would you say the focus has to be something else? How do we go about it?
Yeah, I think, that there's the question of should versus will. And the should is very much a personal values discussion. I'm not going to offer that, but I'll offer a statement about what I think will happen. And that is that the dominant societal response will be adaptation. Adaptation has a lot to recommend it. First of all, it's agnostic. It doesn't matter whether the climate's changing because of human influences or naturally. It's proportional. If the climate changes less, you adapt less. If the climate changes more, you adapt more. It's what society does naturally. I mean, we have, of course, been doing that, whether it's the Dutch building dikes or, tuning our agricultural crops to local conditions. And it's very saleable to people because it's local, it's pretty immediate, and it's not in response to some vague threat 2 generations away and halfway around the world. So society is going to adapt, and we need to figure out how to make it most capable of adapting. And a large part of that is bringing the developing world up to standards that we expect in modern developed economies in terms of rule of law, institutional strength, governance, and of course, economics, the ability to execute large projects that would enable adaptation and so on. So I think that's the main thing we need to do. And of course, there are many other benefits from doing it anyway, is let's help the developed world become better, the developing world become better.
If I could, I'd like to jump in with one comment, being a dumb economist, not a smart physicist like you guys. If we look at the state of the US economy now, for example, investment in energy is roughly half of what it was, and oil production, roughly half of what it was just a few years ago. The Biden administration canceled the Keystone Pipeline. The cost of transporting energy that we produce is a critical variable. The public hostility to anything to do with carbon emission is so great that even highly profitable projects in the oil patch are being avoided by investors because they don't want to be seen as environmentally unfriendly. And if this leads to higher inflation and ultimately lower economic growth, our capacity to make the investments that we wish to make, which really would be beneficial, let's say more nuclear power plants, whatever the right technology is, will be diminished. So we could easily shoot ourselves in the foot.
I think the administration's efforts to curtail oil and gas production in the US, which is a different issue than power, but let's talk about oil and gas for a minute, are woefully misguided. If the US cuts back on its domestic production, that slack will be picked up by countries in the Middle East and by Russia, and will not result in any significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. But you will clobber some number of millions of jobs that the oil and gas industry supports, and 8% of the US GDP. And perhaps even more importantly, you will make the country more dependent upon imported energy than it is currently. It's really quite independent right now. So all in all, I think you have to ask, do you want to do those things for effectively minimal impact? And I don't think that case has been laid out convincingly to the public or to the financial decision makers. And I would hope that my book is a start to having a fact-based discussion of the values that I've tried to, the values discussion that really needs to happen.
Maybe I would rise. I think you touched, or Uwe also, on a very fundamental kind of an issue. We are observing this quasi-religious, development, a spread of a kind of quasi-religious feeling and motivation, not least of all among young people. And I think this reflects to a certain extent that young people nowadays, many of them, disoriented and don't have sort of a definition. What is good? Okay, you have your career, but what is good to do? Where can I find an overriding moral purpose or cause other than this pressure of career? And the saving the planet is a perfect concept. If I'm contributing to saving the planet, well, now I have a sense of the purpose of my life. So on the other hand, you raised, there's another direction, which you actually brought in. I found that Biden, in a certain way, responds or is trying to respond to a certain pessimism by being very upbeat. Jobs, growth, and so forth. They may not be doing it the right way in terms of the climate policy, but it is an issue. Now, the question of the developing countries, which you just brought up, seems to me very, very important, because there's something which is definitely good. Very few people would think it's bad for developing countries to be modernized, to have water, to have energy. And now, ironically, it seems that the new Silk Road, the Chinese infrastructure investment has somehow now gotten the G7 people suddenly discovered that you can maybe help developing countries by helping them to develop infrastructure. What do you think of that kind of an orientation?
You know, the focus on saving the planet that we have in the developed world is, of course, well, we can argue whether the planet really is in peril, but it is fundamentally a good thing to do, to try to preserve the environment that we have. On the other hand, an equally and more tangible noble cause is the betterment of 6 billion people who are not in the developed world. I think fundamentally the saving planet thing is a narcissistic or self-centered view of things, because in fact, if you were to ask people in the undeveloped countries, sub-Saharan Africa, to some extent parts of rural India, what would most improve your life? It's energy. it's not reduction of greenhouse gases. And I think, the administration, the politicians more generally, could gracefully pivot to that betterment of most of humanity rather than this uncertain and vague notion of saving the planet.
We have two or three questions which I'll try to consolidate into the same one. And their theme is, isn't there a set of asymmetric risks here? If we're deliberate and slow and cautious about addressing climate change, the downside is that we're wrong and we have an environmental catastrophe which will destroy vast amounts of life. If we are too panicky and we do too much, perhaps will affect economic growth in some ways, but the damage that we do by not taking extreme action is much less than the damage might occur if we're wrong and we don't take the kind of action we need to. That's the theme of several questions, so I wanted to perhaps.
So, yeah, I mean, we need to address this problem thoughtfully and at the right pace, if it is a problem. But in fact, if you read the UN and US government reports, a warming of 6 degrees by the end of the century, so that's 4 times the Paris limit, would have a few percent, 3-4% impact on either the global or US economy. That's the same as saying our economic growth would be retarded at the end of this century by a couple years. So yes, there are always improbable events that can happen, and we need to be watching carefully. But in fact, the consensus science does not project catastrophe. So I think a slow, thoughtful approach to the problem is what we should be doing.
Thank you. Uwe and Jonathan, any concluding questions?
I just one thought on this whole what are our choices? I think it's unrealistic to assume, I think, that we will be able to change the sort of current tide of even ultra environmentalism and all that goes with it in the near term. But there must be ways of addressing this. This webinar is an effort to do so. I think you mentioned that you are going to go to different universities. You will probably be treated to a certain dose of lack of free speech that others in controversial situations have been. But how do you see this play out? I mean, it seems to me that one thing is certain, that we cannot arbitrarily try to restrict economic growth in the third world, and therefore, the fundamental question that you raise is people have to at least begin to understand where the science leads us, as opposed to where certain voices from Sweden near the polar circle or something would like to lead us.
So I think what's going to happen in the next couple of years, at least in the US, as the administration's policies start to bite, the grid may become less reliable, electricity and fuel more expensive, consumer choice in vehicles more restricted, US geopolitical leverage in energy reduced. People are going to ask, tell me again why we're doing all of this?
Yes.
And I think that might lead to a much more rigorous look at the science and a much better discussion of the values that will inform what our policy should be. So I think that's what's going to happen.
Let me say in conclusion, once again, please do buy Professor Koonin's book, Unsettled, and please do subscribe to Asia Times. We're grateful for your participation in this and other events. We do need your support to continue them, so thank you in advance. And thanks, of course, to those of you who have subscribed. With that, I'll thank all the panelists, and we'll conclude the webinar now.
Thank you, Professor Koonin, for
Thank you.
your contribution. Thank you very
You're
much.
welcome. Thank you for a good discussion.
Thank you.
Yes, then.